Part 1. The Woman Nobody Wanted. The wagon road into Blackstone Ranch was not the kind that welcomed you. It was rutted and dry, cracked open by the previous summer's heat, and never properly graded since. And the wheels of the supply rig Marin had hitched a ride on knocked and jolted the whole way in until she was grateful just to get her feet back on solid ground. The driver, a heavy-set man named Orrin, who hadn't said much beyond grunting the price at the start of the journey, stopped short of the main gate and nodded his head toward the house in the distance. "End of the line for me," he said. Marin climbed down with her bag, a battered leather satchel that held 2 changes of clothes, a small jar of dried herbs she'd been carrying since Kansas, and a letter of employment that had taken 6 weeks to arrive and another 2 weeks to act on. She stood in the dust and watched the wagon roll back the way it had come, and then she turned and looked at the ranch. It was a wide, flat property, the kind that felt emptier than it was because the horizon stretched out in every direction with nothing tall enough to interrupt it. The main house was a 2-story clapboard structure that had once been painted white, but now showed more bare wood than paint, and the porch railing on the left side had separated from its post and leaned outward at an angle that said nobody had gotten around to fixing it. 3 outbuildings sat behind and to the right, a barn, a smaller shed, and what looked like a smokehouse that hadn't been used recently enough to smell of anything. 2 horses moved slowly in the paddock. A crow sat on the fence post nearest the gate and watched her with the particular disinterest of a creature that had seen too many strangers arrive and not enough of them stay. Marin picked up her satchel and started walking. She was 35 years old, and she had been in domestic work since she was 19. Before that, she had been in her mother's house in Missouri, learning to manage a household the way most girls in those years learned, not from books, but from necessity, from watching and doing and getting it wrong until you got it right. She had small hands that were rougher than they looked, and she walked the way women who carry things for a living tend to walk, with a slight forward lean and her eyes already taking in what needed doing. The porch step was loose. There was a curtain missing from the front window. The woodbox beside the door was empty. She knocked twice. There was a pause long enough for her to wonder if anyone was home, and then the door opened and she was looking at a man she took to be Silas Boone. He was tall, not quite as tall as the doorframe, with dark hair that could have used cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been set at a particular angle and never quite relaxed. He was wearing a work shirt, no vest, and he'd been outside recently. She could tell by the dust on his boots and the way he was still holding a pair of leather work gloves folded in one hand. He looked at her. She looked at him. His expression was not rude, exactly. It was just plainly, visibly wrong. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "Miss," she said. "Marin Holt. You'll have gotten my letter in reply to the advertisement." "I did." He didn't move from the doorway. The advertisement said experienced. "I've been in household work 16 years. It also said—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider how to finish the sentence, didn't quite manage it. Marin understood him perfectly. The advertisement had said experienced, yes, but what Silas Boone had wanted, and probably what he'd expected, was someone younger, someone who looked more capable of energy and less capable of knowing how tired a household could make you. Someone who arrived looking like a fresh start, rather than like a person who had already lived something. She was not young. She was not soft-faced or quick-smiling. She was a woman who had gone gray at the temples before 30 and didn't mind it, who wore practical shoes, and who was currently standing on a porch in Wyoming looking at a man who was trying to find the polite way to tell her she wasn't what he'd ordered. "Mr. Boone," she said, "when did your children last have a proper meal?" He blinked. The question had caught him somewhere he wasn't expecting to be caught. "They had breakfast." "What did they have?" A pause. "Bread." "Just bread." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "I'm not asking to embarrass you," Marin said. "I'm asking because if there's food in that kitchen I can do something with, I'd like to start there. We can talk terms after supper." He looked at her for another moment. The crow on the fence post made a sound like a door hinge. Then Silas Boone stepped back from the doorway, and Marin walked inside. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something. It wasn't filthy. She'd walked into filthy houses before, and this wasn't one of them, but it had the particular dishevelment of a space that had been managed by someone who was keeping up with it through sheer force of obligation rather than any knowledge of how to do it. The dishes were washed, but stacked wrong. the heavier ones on top of the lighter ones in a way that would break something eventually. The flour barrel was nearly empty. The grease can on the shelf beside the stove was down to a scrape. There were 3 potatoes in the vegetable bin, some onions that were going soft but not yet bad, a heel of salt pork that still had some use left in it, a jar of dried beans, and about half a pound of cornmeal. Not much. Enough. She set her satchel down beside the door and took off her coat and looked for a hook to hang it on. There wasn't one. She laid it over the back of a chair and rolled up her sleeves and started a fire. The children appeared while she was working. They came in the way children come into a space when they're not sure if they're allowed to be there. The oldest first, testing the ground, then the others behind him. The boy in front was Tobias. She knew his name from the letter Silas had sent when she replied to the advertisement, a letter that had been more thorough than she expected. 3 pages in tight handwriting that told her the children's names and ages and mentioned once, and in a way that moved right past it, that their mother had passed the previous winter. Tobias was 12, with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, which she knew were his mother's because they had a particular quality of open feeling that Silas Boone's did not. He was trying to hold himself in a way that looked like he wasn't watching her carefully. He was watching her very carefully. Behind him was a girl of about 8. Clara. She had her hair in a braid that someone had done several days ago and hadn't redone, and she was carrying a cloth doll that had seen considerable use. She stopped in the doorway and pressed her shoulder against the frame. The smallest one, Eli, who was 5, hung back the most. He came around the corner of the door frame slowly, the way a cat comes around a corner when it isn't sure what's on the other side. He was thin in a way that made Marin's chest tighten. "Hello?" said Tobias, with the particular tone of a boy who was speaking for a group that hadn't agreed to be spoken for. "Hello," said Marin. She was cutting the onion and she didn't stop. "I'm Marin. I'm going to be keeping house here for a while." She looked over her shoulder at them. "Are you 3 hungry?" Clara nodded first. Tobias held back 1 second longer, preserving dignity, and then nodded too. Eli looked at his brother, saw the nod, and then looked at Marin with very large eyes and said nothing. "All right then," she said. "Sit down somewhere and let me work." They sat at the table, all 3 of them in a row, which made her want to smile, but she didn't. She worked. The salt pork went into the cast iron with the onions. The beans had been soaking since she looked at the pot. Since morning, someone had thought to do that much. She started the cornbread. She worked the way she always worked, which was without drama and without announcement, doing each thing in order. And after a while, the kitchen began to smell like something. After a few minutes, Tobias said, "You from back east?" "Missouri, originally." "Why'd you come out here?" "Work," she said. "Plenty of work back east." "Plenty of people looking for it, too." She stirred the pot. "Less competition out this way." He considered this. "Our last housekeeper only stayed 2 weeks." "What happened to her?" "She said the country was too lonesome." Myron looked out the window at the flat open land and the wide pale sky. "It is lonesome," she said. "Doesn't mean it's not worth being in." Tobias looked at her sideways. Clara had stopped watching her quite so cautiously and was now watching the stove, which was the more interesting thing. Eli had fallen asleep sitting up against his brother's arm, which told Marin more about the state of things in this household than anything else could have. Silas came in when the food was nearly ready. He stood in the kitchen doorway the way he'd stood in the front doorway, not blocking it exactly, but present in a way that took up space. He looked at the children at the table, then at the stove, then at Marin, in that order. "Beans aren't done yet," she said. "Cornbread's ready. Sit down if you want it hot." "I didn't say you were hired." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She turned and looked at him directly. "I haven't agreed to your terms either. We can talk after supper." He looked at the children again. Clara was picking at the corner of the tablecloth. Tobias was looking at him with an expression that was very carefully not an expression at all. Eli was still half asleep against his brother's arm, and the kitchen smelled like food, actually smelled like something being cooked with intent. And Silas Boone pulled out a chair and sat down. Marin served the cornbread first, then the pork and onions over what beans were ready, and she sat at the end of the table with a small plate of her own and ate without making conversation. She didn't believe in making conversation when food was the first order of business. The children ate. Silas ate with less apparent enthusiasm, but he ate steadily, and the pot came close to empty, which told her everything she needed to know about how they'd been eating. Afterward, when the children had drifted out, and Silas was still sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she'd made from the tin she'd found behind the flour barrel, they talked terms. He named a wage that was low. She said so. He went up a little. She said the room and board would count against the wage or she'd want more. He said the room was small. She said she'd seen the rooms in this house already from the hallway, and they weren't small. He was quiet. She waited. He agreed to the wage. "I need to know what happened with the previous housekeepers," she said. He looked at her. "How many do you want to know about?" "How many were there?" "4 since March," she did the math. "That's 1 every 6 weeks." "About." "What happened to them?" He looked at his coffee. "The first one couldn't manage Tobias. He wasn't easy for a while there." A pause. "The second one left when the weather turned bad in April. The third one found a husband, which I don't begrudge her. The fourth one—" He stopped. "She said the children were difficult." "Are they?" He looked up. "They lost their mother." "Yes," said Marin. "I know what that does to children. I lost mine at 10. He was quiet for a moment. "The advertisement said experienced." "I am." "I meant—" He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "I thought experience meant younger, faster. There's a lot of physical work here. Laundry, hauling water, the kitchen garden if it's going to produce anything this summer. You thought a younger woman would work harder." He met her eyes. Had the decency not to deny it. "Yes. Mr. Boone," she said, "I have been doing this work since I was 19 years old. I am not fast in the way you mean. I am thorough, which is a different thing. I don't leave. I don't get frightened by hard work or difficult children or lonesome country." She picked up her coffee cup. "The 4 women who left in 6 weeks were probably capable. They just weren't suited. I'm suited." "You sound very certain of that." "I am," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. "All right," he said at last. "You can have the room at the end of the hall." On. The room at the end of the hall was small. He hadn't been lying about that, but it had a window that faced east and a hook on the back of the door and a narrow bed with a decent mattress. She'd slept in worse. She unpacked her satchel that night, set the jar of dried herbs on the windowsill, hung her coat on the hook, and lay down on top of the bed covers in her clothes because she was too tired to do anything else. And she looked at the ceiling and thought about the boy Tobias's face when she'd put the plate of cornbread in front of him. She hadn't thought much about what she was getting herself into when she replied to the advertisement. She'd been in Cheyenne, in a boarding house, between positions, and she'd read the notice in the newspaper, and it had seemed like what it was. A ranch, 3 children, outdoor work required. She wasn't sentimental about domestic work. It was work. It tired you. Some households were better than others. Some employers were decent and some were not. And you learned, after enough years, to read the difference before you signed on, and sometimes you got it wrong and sometimes you got it right. But lying in the small room at the end of the hall, listening to the wind pick up outside the east window, she thought about Eli pressed against his brother's arm at the table, and Clara's braid coming undone at the bottom, and Tobias trying so hard not to look like he wanted someone to take care of him. She thought about Silas Boone's face when she'd asked him when the children last had a proper meal, and the way the question had caught him somewhere undefended. She was not here to fix a family. She was here to do a job. She believed that when she thought it. She was almost sure she believed it. The first 2 weeks were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, but grinding. She was up before light, because the mornings were the only window for hauling water before the day heated up. The well was 100 yards from the back of the house, and she made 3 trips each morning with a yoke and 2 buckets. And by the end of the first week, her shoulders were sore in a deep, persistent way she hadn't felt since her 30s started edging toward the middle. She didn't say anything about it. She rubbed them at night with the liniment she kept in the bottom of her satchel and went to sleep. The kitchen garden was in poor shape. Someone had put seeds in. She could see that. But weeding had been sporadic at best, and 2 of the rows had been taken over by something broad-leafed and persistent that she spent the better part of 2 mornings pulling out by the roots. She found the children watching her from the fence the first morning, all 3 of them in a row like birds on a wire. You can help if you want, she said, or you can watch. Either way. Tobias came through the fence first. He wasn't graceful about it. He caught his shirt on the rail. But he came through and took the other end of the row she was working. He pulled weeds with more force than efficiency, which she decided to let go of for now. Getting him there was the thing. Clara came next, more cautiously, and Eli came last because Eli went last in everything. He mostly moved things from one place to another and looked at worms with deep scientific interest. But he was there, and being there was something. My mama used to do the garden, Clara said at one point. Marin was on her knees in the dirt. What did she grow? Beans and squash. And she tried tomatoes once, but Pa said the season wasn't long enough. He was probably right. It's short up here. She did them anyway. How'd they come out? Clara thought about it. They were small, but we ate them. Marin looked at the row she was clearing. Good for her, she said, and meant it. Silas kept his distance. Not coldly. She'd worked for cold employers and knew what that felt like. The deliberate withdrawal, the way they made you feel invisible unless they wanted something. This was different. He was around. He came in for meals. He sometimes sat on the porch in the evening with a cup of coffee. He answered when she spoke to him. But he kept a careful space between himself and whatever was happening in the house, as if he'd decided to wait and see before he let himself believe it would last. She understood that. She even respected it, a little. He'd had 4 housekeepers in 6 weeks. He'd stopped counting on things continuing. She just made sure things continued. There were days it was harder than she'd expected. There was a Wednesday in the second week when Tobias came to supper in a mood that crackled, when he answered every question she asked with 2 words or less, and at one point shoved back from the table so hard the bench scraped the floor. And she let him go without calling him back because she knew the difference between a boy being difficult and a boy being full of something he didn't have words for yet. She was right, because he came back 15 minutes later and sat down and finished his supper without saying anything, and she didn't make him explain himself. That was its own kind of decision. There was a morning when the stove drew wrong and the kitchen filled with smoke, and she burned a pot of porridge and had to throw it out and start over. And by the time she had something edible, it was an hour past when she'd wanted to serve it, and she sat down at the kitchen table alone for 10 minutes afterward and pressed her hands flat on the tabletop and just breathed, not giving up, just stopping for 10 minutes. There was an afternoon when she went to the supply ledger. She'd asked Silas to let her manage the provisioning, and he'd agreed with the air of a man handing over a problem he'd been glad to see the back of, and found that things were considerably tighter than she'd realized. Not desperate, not yet, but tight in a way that meant she'd be managing very carefully going forward, that there was no room for waste or miscalculation. She sat with the ledger for an hour, going over the numbers, and then she made a list and rearranged her menu plan for the next 2 weeks, and it was doable, but just barely. She told Silas that evening. She didn't soften it more than it needed to be softened. I know, he said. He was looking at the fire in the front room, and he said it in a way that meant he'd known for longer than she had. The spring sales were... He stopped. They didn't go how I hoped. Is there credit at the general store? Some. I've been careful with it. You'll need to let me know the limit. He told her. She filed the number away. All right, she said. I can work with that. He looked at her. You're not concerned. I'm very concerned, she said. I just don't find it useful to be concerned out loud. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like a loosening, a slight easing around the corners of his mouth. But it was the closest she'd seen from him, and she filed that away too. What changed things with Eli was something small. Most of the things that mattered most, she'd found, were small. He had taken to following her around the house in the mornings, not quite close enough to seem like he was following her, but never quite far enough away for her to believe he wasn't. He was a quiet child. Tobias had told her, matter-of-factly, that Eli had been quiet since their mother died. He used to talk a lot, Tobias said. He doesn't really anymore. He said it the way children report on things that are true and painful and that they've had to learn to live alongside. She never pushed Eli to talk. She just made sure she was where he could find her. The morning it changed, she was in the kitchen making biscuits. Eli had come in and taken up his usual position at the edge of the room, close to the doorway but facing in. She was working the dough and not paying him particular attention, and she started humming without thinking about it. An old song her mother used to hum, something without words that her mother had said came from her mother's mother. No title, just a tune that went up and came back down in a particular way. After a minute, she heard a small sound from the direction of the doorway. She didn't look up. The sound came again. She kept working the dough. Then, in a voice so small it was almost not a voice at all, "I know that song." She kept her eyes on the dough. "Do you?" "My mama hummed it." A pause. "When she was doing something." "Good song for doing things," Marin said. Silence. She counted the beats, turned the dough. "Will you keep humming it?" Eli said. "Sure," she said. She kept humming. After a while, she heard him come the rest of the way into the kitchen, and then he was beside her at the table, watching her hands work the dough, and she hummed the song her mother had taught her without words and didn't make anything out of it. Because sometimes the most important thing you could do was let something be what it was without making it into more. By the end of the first month, the house had a different quality to it. Not transformed. She didn't believe in transformations. They were the kind of thing people talked about who hadn't done real work. But different. The floor got swept every morning. The water was never short. Meals happened at the same times every day. And the food was plain, but there was enough of it. And the children came to the table without being called twice. Claire had started helping in the kitchen after supper, washing up. And she wasn't efficient at it, but she was trying, and efficiency came later. Tobias had started talking to her, not confiding. She wasn't his mother, and she knew better than to want to be. But actually talking, telling her things about the ranch, about the horse he was learning to work with, about a disagreement he'd had with a boy in town. She listened without advice unless he asked for it, and sometimes he asked for it, and she gave it straight, without softening it past usefulness. And he seemed to appreciate that. Silas watched all of this from whatever careful distance he maintained. She'd catch him sometimes, when she was in the yard or through the kitchen window, just watching the property. Not looking at her particularly. Just looking at the place in a way that she thought was a man who'd been afraid for a long time, looking to see if he was still afraid. She couldn't know what he was thinking. She didn't try to. She just kept doing the work. But one evening he came into the kitchen while she was setting the bread to rise for the next morning, and he stopped in the doorway, and she could tell he'd come in with something to say. She waited. He looked at the bread dough under its cloth on the counter. "The Hendersons were here today," he said, "while you were out with the children." "What did they want?" "Checking in." A pause. "Mrs. Henderson asked how things were going." "What did you tell her?" He looked at her. "I said they were going fine." She turned back to the counter. "Good." "Marin." She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through whatever he'd come in here to say, and she waited, because she was good at waiting. "I was wrong," he said at last. "About when you first got here. What I thought." She considered this. "Well," she said, "you didn't know me." "No," he said, "but I should have." He stopped again. "I'm saying I was wrong. That's all I'm saying." She held his eyes for a moment. "All right," she said. "I heard you." It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness of something that hadn't required forgiving. It was just acknowledgement, which was what he'd needed. And she knew that, and she gave it. He nodded once and went back out. She turned to the dough. The wind was starting up outside. She could hear it in the eaves. She covered the bread and washed her hands and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the flat, dark land and the sky beginning to fill up with cloud. Something was coming. She could feel it in the drop in the air pressure, in the way the horses had been moving in the paddock that afternoon, restless and tight. She didn't know yet what it was going to cost her. She just covered the bread and went to bed. The storm she'd felt coming that night didn't arrive for another 3 days. And when it did, it wasn't the dramatic kind. Not the kind with lightning and theater. It was the slow grinding kind. A cold front that rolled in off the high country and settled over the ranch like something that had decided to stay, dropping temperatures fast and bringing with it a wet, sideways wind that made every outdoor task twice as hard and took twice as long. The horses didn't like it. The children didn't like it. The kitchen stove drew badly in that kind of wind because the chimney pole went wrong, and Marin spent 2 mornings fighting to keep the temperature even enough to cook on. She managed. She always managed. But there were mornings she stood at the back door before going out to the well and just looked at the sky for a moment and thought, All right then, and went out anyway. That was the truth of frontier work that nobody who hadn't done it understood. It wasn't one hard thing. It was the accumulation of ordinary things made harder by circumstance, strung together day after day until you either found a way to carry the weight or you put it down and left. 4 women had put it down and left. Marin understood why. She didn't judge them. She just wasn't built the same way. The cold front held for a week, and during that week she learned several things about the Boone household that she hadn't known before. She learned that Tobias had been doing more than his share before she arrived. Not because anyone asked him to, but because someone had to, and he was the oldest, and he'd been carrying that knowledge with a 12-year-old's particular combination of pride and resentment that she recognized from a long way off. She started redistributing things quietly, giving him less of what he'd taken on by default and more of what he'd actually chosen, which was the horses. He was good with the horses. Better than good. He had a natural way of being around large animals, unhurried and even, that she'd seen in maybe 3 or 4 people in her life, and watching him work the paddock fence line with the gray gelding on a cold morning was one of the better things about the job. She learned that Clara had a habit of hoarding small things, not stealing, nothing like that, but collecting. Smooth stones, interesting pieces of wire, a button that had fallen off Marin's own coat and that she'd given the girl rather than replacing it. Clara kept these things in a tin under her bed. Marin found out about the tin by accident when Clara left the lid off and a stone rolled under the doorframe into the hall, and when she brought it back in and set it on the bed, Clara went white with something that looked like fear. "I didn't take anything," Clara said quickly, defensively, in the voice of a child who'd been accused before. "I know that," Marin said. "What's in the tin?" Clara showed her warily, one item at a time. Marin looked at each thing with interest and asked about 2 of them and said nothing else. And she watched Clara's shoulders come down from where they'd been, up around her ears, and she thought about what it meant that a small girl in a quiet house felt the need to keep things hidden, and she didn't ask about that either, not yet. She learned that Silas woke before anyone, well before light, and went out to the barn for an hour before coming back in. She noticed this because she woke early herself, and twice she saw the barn light through the east window of her room. She didn't ask about it. The barn was his business. But she noticed. And she learned over the long cold week that Eli was starting to come back from wherever he'd gone when his mother died. It happened slowly. He began to appear at her elbow in the kitchen, not just in the mornings, but through the day, materializing at her side the way small children materialize when they've decided you're safe, without announcement and without apparent reason. He started pointing at things, the jar of dried herbs on the windowsill, the pattern on the cloth she used to cover the rising bread, a spider making a web in the corner of the window. And she'd tell him what he was looking at, or what it was called, or whatever she knew about it, and he'd listen with his head tilted slightly, and then he'd move on to the next thing. He was learning the world by cataloging it with her, and she understood that was what he was doing and let it happen. He still didn't talk much, but he was there, and being there was different from hiding. He used to ask why about everything, Tobias told her one evening. They were in the front room. She was mending a pair of Eli's trousers. Tobias was supposed to be doing his reading, but wasn't. And he said it without particular preamble. Just put it out there into the room. Every single thing. Why is the sky that color? Why do horses sleep standing up? Why do we cook beans and not just eat them dry? Drove Pa half out of his mind sometimes. He stopped. It was annoying that, he said, in the voice of a boy who missed it terribly. Marin kept her eyes on the mending. Give him time. It's been 4 months. 4 months isn't time, she said. 4 months is just the beginning of time. Tobias was quiet. Then, how do you know? She looked up. I lost someone important to me when I was young. Not my mother. Someone else. And it took a lot longer than 4 months before I was the same as I was before. She paused. I wasn't quite the same, but I was close enough. He looked at her. Are you saying Eli won't ever be the same? I'm saying he'll be himself, and that'll be good enough. Tobias thought about this for a long time. Then he picked up his book. She went back to the mending. The fire shifted in the grate, and outside the cold front was finally, slowly, beginning to ease. The first real test with the townspeople came on a Friday when Marin went into Caldwell Creek with Silas to collect supplies. Caldwell Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a feed supplier, a small hotel that also served as a saloon after 5 in the afternoon, a smithy, a post office that shared space with a dry goods counter, and the particular social ecosystem of small frontier towns, which meant that everyone knew everyone else's business and formed opinions fast and revised them slowly. Marin had been in enough of these towns to know how they worked. She didn't mind them, but she kept her eyes open. The woman at the general store eats Mrs. Aldine Pratt, a small, sharp-faced woman in her 60s who had the manner of someone who'd been managing this particular enterprise since before half the county was born, looked Marin up and down when Silas introduced her, with the frank appraising look that small-town women use when they've already decided something and are checking whether the evidence confirms it. "You're the new housekeeper," Mrs. Pratt said. "Yes," said Marin. "Heard Silas had someone new out at Blackstone." She said it to Marin, but looked at Silas when she said it. "How long have you been out there?" "A month," said Marin. Mrs. Pratt raised her eyebrows a fraction. "Longer than the others." "I tend to stay where I go," Marin said. Mrs. Pratt looked at her. Then something shifted in the older woman's face. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of a recalculation. "I'll get your order," she said, and went to the back. While she was gone, a man Marin didn't know came in from the street, stamping dust off his boots. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the chest, with the look of someone who'd done well enough to stop worrying about most things. He clapped Silas on the shoulder the way men do when they're familiar. "Boone," he said, "heard things are shaping up out at your place." "Getting there," Silas said. The man glanced at Marin with uncomplicated curiosity. "This the new woman?" "Marin Holt," she said, because Silas had paused a half-second. "Dale Whittier." He looked at her the way the man at the ranch gate probably looked at everyone who came through. Assessing, quick. "You staying on, then?" "That's my intention." He seemed to find this mildly interesting in the way a man finds things interesting that he doesn't expect to keep thinking about. "The Henderson woman said you had those kids eating regular again." "They were eating before I arrived," Marin said. Whittier laughed, short and genuine. "Fair enough." He turned back to Silas. "The Caldwell Creek stock sale is the 23rd. You bringing any of the herd?" They shifted into ranch talk, and she let them. She moved to the counter to check the order list against what was available, which was what she'd come to do. And she did it. But she was aware of the town around her, aware of the 2 women who came in while she was there and nodded at her with the particular courtesy that carries a question inside it. Aware of the way Mrs. Pratt asked once with careful casualness whether she'd had household experience before, and accepted Marin's answer without pushing, but stored it for later use, the way women in small towns store information that might be useful in future assessments. Marin had been assessed by enough small towns to know that the best thing she could do was be exactly what she was and let the assessment arrive at its own conclusions. The wagon was loaded and they were almost ready to leave when a woman came across the street toward them with the directness of someone who'd been watching and waiting for her moment. She was close to Marin's age, fair-haired, with a baby on one hip and the tired, capable look of a woman who ran a household and was honest about what it cost her. "You're Marin Holt," she said. "I am." "Ruth Calhoun. My husband runs the feed supply." She shifted the baby. "My neighbor's girl was going to go out to Blackstone. She saw the advertisement in March and wrote, but then she heard—" She stopped, seemed to reconsider. She heard Silas Boone was difficult. Silas, 2 feet away loading the wagon, said nothing. Marin said, "Is she still looking for a position?" Ruth blinked. "No, she found something in Laramie." "Good for her," said Marin. "Laramie's not bad." Ruth looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. "How are those children doing?" "Better," said Marin. "Are you—" She seemed to be trying to find the right way to ask something. "Are you getting on all right out there? I mean, are you treated?" "Fine," said Marin. "Everything's fine." Ruth looked at her a moment longer, as if checking the answer against something internal. Then she nodded, once, and seemed satisfied or satisfied enough. "All right then," she said. "If you ever want company, Mrs. Calhoun on Ridgeway is easy to find." "Thank you," said Marin, and meant it more than she might have expected. On the way back to the ranch, the wagon loaded with supplies, the sky cleared up in the west to a pale winter blue. Silas drove without talking for about a mile and then said, "People wonder about things out here. It's a small town." "I know it is," said Marin. I wasn't trying to make your life harder by bringing you in. She looked at the road ahead. I know that too. Whittier's all right. He just asks about everything. A pause. Ruth Calhoun is good people. She seemed it. Another long silence. The horses moved steady on the road. The supplies shifted and settled behind them. They thought I was running through help because I was... He stopped. They thought it was me. Were they wrong? She said, not unkindly. He considered that. Maybe not entirely. She didn't say anything. He drove. The sky stayed blue. The kitchen garden came back in the second month. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about a kitchen garden. But the broad-leafed, persistent things she'd pulled out in the first weeks hadn't come back the way she'd feared it might. And the beans she'd replanted after the cold front took the first crop were coming up in good straight rows, and the squash Silas had planted in April, before she arrived, he'd managed that much, was beginning to spread and show small hard fruits along the runners. Clara started taking ownership of one row, which Marin had done deliberately, assigning it without fanfare, just saying one morning in the garden, that row's yours, you decide what goes in it. And watching Clara stand very still for a moment with the particular look of a child who has been given a real thing and isn't sure what to do with it yet. Clara put in carrots. She didn't ask anyone's opinion. She just did it, and she watered them every evening. And when the first shoots came up, she came running inside to tell Marin with more volume than she'd used for anything since Marin arrived. And Marin said, "All right, don't pull them yet. They need another few weeks." And Clara went back outside to look at them again, like she didn't quite trust them to keep existing if she wasn't watching. Eli went with her. He crouched beside the carrot row and looked at the shoots and said, almost to himself, "They're very small." "They'll get bigger," Clara told him, with an authority that was mostly performed. "How do you know?" "Because that's what carrots do." Eli thought about this. Then, "How long until they're a regular size?" Marin said a few weeks. "How many weeks is a few?" "I don't know," Clara said. "More than 2, less than a lot." Eli appeared to accept this. He stayed crouched by the row for a while longer, watching the small shoots as if he might catch them growing. Marin was at the kitchen window and saw all of this, and she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, just looking. The supply problem didn't resolve itself. She hadn't thought it would. By the middle of the second month, she had the provisioning as efficient as she could make it, which meant meals that were filling and varied within tight constraints, that used everything and wasted nothing, and that required a degree of planning she did in her head each evening while the children finished supper. She was good at that kind of math. She'd always been good at it. But the numbers had a ceiling, and the ceiling was real. She brought it to Silas on a Tuesday evening, because Tuesday evenings were when he was most likely to be in the house at a reasonable hour and not already tired past the point of useful conversation. She put the ledger on the table and sat across from him. "We're going to be short in August," she said, "if the ranch income doesn't come up." He looked at the ledger. "I know. What's the plan for the stock sale?" "Take 12 head, maybe 14 if I can get them ready." "What's the market looking like?" He rubbed his hand over his jaw. "Fair, not good, not bad. Whittier thinks prices are steady." "Is there anything else you can sell?" She said it carefully, because she knew this was the kind of question that could go either way. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about the East Pasture. There's a man in Laramie interested in leasing it through October." "What would that bring in?" He told her. She did the calculation. "That gets us through August and into September, if I'm careful." "You're always careful." "I'm more careful than I used to be," she said, which was as honest as it was. "Will you do the lease?" He looked at the ledger again. "I'll write to the man in Laramie." "Good." She closed the ledger. "There's something else." He looked at her. "Tobias needs new boots. His have split at the sole. He's been stuffing the gap with a folded piece of cloth and not saying anything about it." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a breath that was slow and not quite even. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't," she said. "Not an accusation, just fact." "He should have said something." "He's 12 and he didn't want to ask for something he thought couldn't be gotten." She paused. "He's a proud boy. He gets it honestly." Silas met her eyes. He didn't argue. "I'll get him to Caldwell Creek this week." "Thank you," she said. She gathered the ledger and her pencil and went back to the kitchen, and she heard behind her the particular silence of a man sitting alone at a table with something he hadn't known about his own son. And she left him to it, because some things you had to sit with yourself before they became manageable. Tobias came back from Caldwell Creek with new boots and an expression that tried hard not to be pleased with itself. He wore them to supper and didn't say anything about them. Neither did Marin. Silas noticed them and nodded, once, and that was the entire exchange. And yet it was somehow more than an exchange because they all knew what it meant without it being said. That was the thing about families, real ones. The words mattered less than what was underneath them. She caught herself thinking that, standing at the stove that evening, and then she caught herself catching herself, and she was careful with what she did with it. This was a household she was employed by. These were not her children. This was not her family. She had done paid work in other people's houses for 16 years, and she knew the difference between being part of a place and belonging to it. She knew the difference. She just wasn't always sure where the line was from the inside. The second real test came from outside the ranch entirely. His name was Gerald Wicks, and he was a man of about 50 who ran the most established spread in the county and who had, Marin gathered this from Ruth Calhoun on her second visit to Caldwell Creek, delivered in the efficient, economical way of a woman who knows you need the information but not the editorial. A history with Silas that went back several years and wasn't friendly. Wicks had been buying up smaller parcels when ranchers hit difficulty, and he'd made an offer on Blackstone Ranch twice in the past 18 months. Silas had refused both times. What that had cost Silas in terms of county standing was apparently more complicated than it seemed, because Wicks was well connected, and Silas was running a ranch alone with 3 children and thinning margins. And there were people in Caldwell Creek who'd quietly formed the opinion that it was only a matter of time. She didn't find this out from Silas. She pieced it together. That was fine. She'd learned more about households by piecing things together than by being told them. What brought it to the surface was a visit. Wicks came to Blackstone Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon when Silas was out on the east pasture. He rode up to the house on a good horse and dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to being met. He knocked on the front door and Marin answered it. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had a broad, pleasant face that was doing the work of being pleasant and probably always did. "Is Boone here?" he asked. "He's out on the property," Marin said. "Can I help you?" "Gerald Wicks." He said the name as if it might mean something to her, which it did, though she didn't let on. "I have business with Silas. I can send a message out to him if you'd like to wait." He looked at her. Then he looked past her into the house, briefly and without much effort to hide it, just taking stock the way men like that did. "You're the new housekeeper. Marin Holt. How long has Silas had you out here?" "A couple of months," she said. She kept her voice even and pleasant and gave him nothing, which was a skill she'd developed working in households where pleasant meant something different on the surface than it did underneath. "I heard he was having trouble keeping help." "Things are running well," she said. "Can I send word out to Mr. Boone, or would you like to leave a message?" He looked at her for a moment. He wasn't aggressive. He was the kind of man who didn't need to be aggressive, which in some ways was harder to deal with, because you couldn't point to anything specific. He was just taking up more space than the conversation required. "Tell him I came by," he said at last. "Tell him I'd like to talk about the east pasture arrangement." "I'll let him know," she said. He nodded, took one more look at the house, not rude, just steady, and went back to his horse and rode out. She stood at the door for a moment after he left, watching the road. Then she went back to the kitchen. She told Silas that evening. She told it plain, without interpretation. Wicks came, said he wanted to talk about the east pasture arrangement. She told him Silas would get the message. She watched Silas's face as she said it, not intrusively, but enough to see what went across it, which was a tightening, a particular kind of tension that had history behind it. "He knows about the Laramie lease," Silas said. "How would he know? This county is small." He was quiet for a moment. "He'll say the east pasture deal is a sign the ranch is in trouble. He'll use it that way." "Are you going to talk to him?" Silas's jaw was set. "I don't particularly want to." "That might not matter," she said. He looked at her. She held the look. He knew what she was saying. Avoiding Wicks didn't make Wicks go away. It just let Wicks make up the narrative while Silas was absent from it. He's been wanting this land, Silas said, more to himself than to her. What's it worth to you to keep it? It was a harder question than it sounded, and she knew that when she asked it. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the table. Outside, the evening was coming down slow and pink, and the horses were moving in the paddock. Everything, he said finally. It's worth everything. Then you'll need to deal with Wicks, she said. On your terms, not his. But you'll need to deal with him. He didn't answer right away. Then, I know. She got up to check on the bread she had in the warming oven, and she let the conversation settle, because she'd said what she had to say and more talking wouldn't improve it. Behind her, she heard him shift in his chair and let out a breath. Not the sound of someone giving up. The sound of someone picking up something heavy. That was the thing about Silas Boone that she was beginning to understand. He wasn't weak. He wasn't broken. He was a man who had taken one loss too many in too short a time, and who had gotten into the habit of bracing for the next one. So much so that he'd stopped doing some of the things that might have prevented it. The ranch had suffered for it. The children had suffered for it. He'd suffered for it in ways he hadn't told her and probably wouldn't. But underneath all of that was someone who had built something real out of nothing, and who still, when pushed to it, could say this is worth everything and mean it. She was beginning to think that mattered. More than she'd expected it to when she knocked on that door 2 months ago with her battered satchel and her jar of dried herbs and her letter of employment that had taken 6 weeks to arrive. She wasn't sentimental about it. She was practical, but practical people notice things too. The wind picked up outside again that night, and she lay in her narrow bed listening to it move around the eaves, and she thought about Gerald Wicks's appraising look at the house, and about the east pasture, and about Tobias's new boots, and about the shoots of Clara's carrots in the garden row. And she thought about the fact that she had been here 2 months, and she was not thinking about leaving. That was new. She paid attention to it, and then she let it go, and she went to sleep. The letter from the man in Laramie came back affirmative on the East Pasture lease, and Silas signed it and sent it back without ceremony, just laid the signed copy on the kitchen table for Marin to see before he took it to the post office. She saw it and said nothing, which was the right response. It was a practical decision made by a practical man, and it didn't require commentary. But she noticed that he'd left it for her to see, and she thought about what that meant. That somewhere in the past 2 months the habit of consulting her had settled in without either of them formally agreeing to it. She filed that away alongside everything else she was filing. The Wicks problem didn't go away. She hadn't expected it to. What happened instead was that Silas rode into Caldwell Creek the following week and had a conversation with Dale Whittier that Marin heard about secondhand through Ruth Calhoun, who had apparently been present at the feed supply when Silas came through, and who reported that Silas had asked Whittier directly about what Wicks was saying around town regarding Blackstone Ranch. What Wicks was saying, it turned out, was precisely what Silas had predicted, that the East Pasture lease was a sign of financial distress, that Boone couldn't hold the place together, that a fair offer was still on the table if Silas came to his senses before the situation got worse. How did Silas take it? Marin asked Ruth. Hard to say, Ruth said. She was wrapping paper around a pound of salt she'd just purchased, and doing it with the careful economy of a woman who didn't waste anything. He didn't say much, but he didn't look like a man who was going to fold on it either. Good, said Marin. Ruth looked at her over the counter. Wicks has bought out 3 operations in this county in 4 years. I know that. The people he bought out didn't think he would either, until he did. I know that too, Marin said. Thank you, Ruth. Ruth handed her the salt. I'm not trying to frighten you. You're not, said Marin. And she wasn't frightened. Frightened wasn't useful. What she was, driving back to the ranch in the small supply wagon she'd gotten comfortable handling on her own, was thinking hard and steadily about what could be done and what couldn't, the way she always thought when a situation started having edges that required navigation. What she concluded by the time the ranch gate came into view was that the best defense against Wicks's narrative was evidence. Not argument, not confrontation, evidence. A ranch that looked like it was running, children who looked like they were cared for, a property that showed signs of being maintained rather than surrendered to. She was already doing most of that. She just needed to keep doing it and do it better. She was still thinking about it when she put the wagon away, which was why she almost didn't notice the sky. July on the high plains of Wyoming had its own specific relationship with weather that she'd been learning since she arrived but hadn't fully reckoned with. The mornings could be bright and wind-still and convincingly peaceful, and by afternoon the sky over the western mountains could do things that people who'd never lived in that country wouldn't have believed if you described them. It built fast. The anvil clouds, she'd heard Tobias use that word, and she'd adopted it because it was right. They did look like something being hammered into shape, came up over the peaks, and moved east with a speed that didn't match how big they were. And the air pressure changed in a way you felt in your ears and in your teeth before you ever saw a cloud. She'd been watching the sky for the better part of a week. There was something in it that she didn't like, a restlessness that the animals felt too. She'd noticed the horses moving differently in the paddock, tighter circles, heads higher, the gray gelding that Tobias worked with stopping at the fence rail and staring west for minutes at a time. She'd mentioned it to Silas, and he'd looked at the sky and said it was probably nothing. She didn't argue with him, but she moved the drying herbs inside from the kitchen porch and made sure the barn doors were hung properly and checked the latch on the storm shutter on the east window of her room, because the nothing she'd been watching for a week was the kind of nothing that preceded something. She was right on a Thursday. She knew it when she woke up at 4 in the morning and the air in her room was wrong. Not cold the way July nights were cold at elevation, but charged, tight and electric in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up before she was fully awake. She got up and went to the window and looked out at a sky that was completely dark. No stars. The cloud cover was total and moving fast, and the trees at the north end of the property were going sideways. The wind hadn't hit the house yet, but it was coming. She could hear it before it arrived, a low freight train sound from the west that got bigger with every second she stood there. She pulled on her clothes and her boots and went down the hall and knocked on Silas's door. "Storm," she said. "Bad one." A beat of silence, then the sound of him moving. She went back down the hall and knocked on Tobias's door. "Get up. Storm's coming in hard." "What time is it?" Tobias's voice, thick with sleep. 4. "Get dressed. Don't wake the little ones yet." She went downstairs. The wind hit the house just as she reached the kitchen, a full broadside gust that rattled every window and shook the back door in its frame and made the stovepipe sing with a sound she didn't like. She crossed to the stove and checked the flue damper. She'd banked the fire before bed, which meant the firebox had coals, which was both useful and a concern if the wind started doing things to the chimney draw. Silas was downstairs inside 2 minutes, moving with the focused efficiency of a man who'd been through this before. He went to the back door and looked out, and the wind nearly took the door from his hand when he opened it. He put his shoulder into it to close it again. "It's a bad one," he said. "I know. I need to get to the barn. The horses will be—" "Go," she said. "Tobias can help you." Tobias was already in the kitchen, hair uncombed, pulling his coat on. He looked at Marin and then at his father. "I'm coming," Tobias said to Silas. "Not a question." Silas put his hand briefly on the back of Tobias's neck, the way a man touches someone when he doesn't have time for words. Then they went out together into the dark and the wind, and the door swung hard behind them. Marin stood in the kitchen and listened to the house. The children upstairs would be waking. The storm was loud enough to wake them. She could hear through the ceiling the sound of small feet on the floorboards. She went to the base of the stairs. "Clara," she called. "Eli, come down." Clara appeared at the top of the stairs first, holding her doll and looking frightened but trying not to be. Eli was behind her, pressed close, both hands on Clara's sleeve. "Is it bad?" Clara asked. "It's loud," Marin said. "Come down and stay in the kitchen. The kitchen's the sturdiest room." That wasn't exactly true. The kitchen was the kitchen, not a storm cellar, but it was true enough in the ways that mattered. The kitchen had the heaviest walls. It was central. The stove was already going, and by the time the children came downstairs, Marin had the fire built up to a working heat and had put water on, because hot water was something you needed in the aftermath of things, and there was no reason not to start it now. She settled the children at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and a blanket around Eli, who was shaking more from cold than fear, she thought, though probably both. She stood at the stove and kept one ear on the house and one on the storm and watched the stovepipe. The wind did what wind does on the open plains. It found every gap. It pushed under the back door and through the space around the kitchen window frame and down the chimney in irregular gusts that made the fire in the stove flare and die and flare again. Each time it flared, the stovepipe expanded, a low metallic ping that she could feel as much as hear. And the third time it happened, she moved closer to the stove and put her hand near the pipe joint without touching it, and felt the heat radiating off it in a way that made her pay full attention. "Marin," Clara said. "Sit still," Marin said. The fourth gust was the one. It came down the chimney harder than the others, and the fire in the firebox surged, and the pipe joint above the stove made a sound that was not the low ping of metal expanding, but a sharp crack, a separation. And then she could see it, a gap in the joint, not wide, but there, and smoke beginning to curl through it into the kitchen air. "All right," she said, very calmly. "Both of you get up. Go into the front room and close the kitchen door behind you, right now." "What's happening?" Claire said. "The pipes come apart a little. Nothing terrible. Go." She waited until they were up and moving, and then she turned back to the stove. The smoke in the kitchen was thin but real, and the gap in the pipe joint was the problem. The smoke was coming through it instead of going up and out, and the longer it went on, the worse it would get. And if the joint failed further, there was a real chance of embers getting loose. The pipe ran close to the wood of the ceiling frame in one spot, closer than it should have been, which she'd noticed her first week and meant to say something about and hadn't. That was where her eyes went now. She needed to close the flue down to reduce the fire's draw. She did that first, the damper lever on the stovepipe, which was hot but manageable with her sleeve pulled over her hand. Then she needed to get something around that joint to hold it until the fire died down enough to fix it properly. She looked around the kitchen for what she had. There was a stack of old dish rags on the shelf. There was the bucket of sand she kept near the stove in winter for ash management. There was water in the kettle, not boiling yet, and a pair of heavy leather mitts she used for handling the cast iron. She pulled on the mitts and took the bucket of sand and moved to the stove. "Marin?" Tobias's voice. He was in the kitchen doorway. He must have come in from outside without her hearing. The storm was that loud. He was wet, and his face was tight. "The barn's fine. Pa's got the horses in the back stalls. What's—" He saw the smoke. "The pipe." "Stay back," she said. "Let me—" "Tobias." She turned and looked at him directly. "Get your brother and sister into the front room. If I need you, I'll call." He didn't argue. She turned back to the stove. The gap in the joint was at the first connection above the firebox, where the pipe angled slightly. She could see the orange of the coals through it when the fire pulsed. The ceiling above was beginning to show a discoloration, a darkening along the grain of the wood where the smoke was traveling. She watched it, calculated, reached up and packed sand around the joint with her gloved hand, pressing it in tight, and the smoke thinned. The fire in the firebox was dying down now with the damper closed, the coals going to dull orange, and the draw reduced. She pressed more sand around the joint and held her hands there. The heat through the leather mitts was manageable. Then it wasn't. The metal of the pipe was conducting in a way that the sand was dampening but not stopping, and she was aware of it moving through the left mitt, a building pressure of heat that she felt first as discomfort and then as something sharper, and she kept her hands there because the joint needed holding and the alternative was worse, and she held it. It took maybe 2 minutes. It felt like longer. The coals in the firebox dropped further. The smoke through the joint thinned to almost nothing. The ceiling stopped darkening. She pulled her hands back and set the bucket down and stood there for a moment breathing. Her left hand was burning, through the mitt, against the palm and the inside of 2 fingers. She pulled the mitt off and looked at her hand, and there it was. The skin reddened and raised in a way that she knew from a childhood burn was going to hurt considerably more in the next hour than it did right now, and it hurt right now enough to make her breath come short. She put her hand in the kettle water, which was warm but not hot, and she stood at the stove and breathed. The storm was still going outside, the wind still moving the house, but the pipe joint was packed, the fire was down, and the ceiling was not burning. She stood there until Silas came in. He came in fast, dripping, his hat gone somewhere in the storm, looking around the kitchen the way a man looks who's registered something was wrong from outside. He took in the smoke smell still in the air, the bucket of sand by the stove, the gap in the pipe joint with the sand packed around it. Then he took in Marin standing at the stove with one hand in the kettle. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. "Let me see." "It's not—" "Let me see your hand." She let him see it. He took her wrist gently, not roughly, the way she might have expected from a man moving that fast, and turned her hand to look at it in the lamplight. The burn was across her palm and down the inside of her first 2 fingers, red and beginning to blister. He said something short and low under his breath. That wasn't a word she'd heard him use before. The pipe joint came apart, she said. I packed the gap with sand. The fire's damped down. The ceiling was getting warm in one spot, but I don't think it got past the surface. He wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking at her hand. Silas? She waited until he met her eyes. The children are in the front room. They're fine. Go check the ceiling joint before the fire comes back up, and then let's deal with this. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not just concern, which was there, but something else. Something that hadn't been in his face the night she arrived, when he'd stood in the doorway and looked at her like she was the wrong answer to a question. He let her wrist go, carefully, and he went to look at the ceiling. She crossed to the shelf where she kept her small medical kit. She'd brought it from her satchel the first week. A cloth case with bandage strips, a tin of salve, a needle, and thread. And she sat down at the kitchen table and began doing what she could for her hand one-handed, which was not elegant but was doable. Tobias appeared in the doorway. He looked at her hand and his face went pale. Is it bad? He said. Moderate, she said. Come help me with this bandage. I can't do the end. He came and held the bandage strip while she tied it, and his hands were steady, which she noted and appreciated. The boy who'd been stuffing his boot sole with a folded cloth and saying nothing was holding a bandage strip without shaking at 4:30 in the morning during a windstorm, and she filed that under things that matter. You stopped the fire, he said, not a question. The fire didn't have much chance to get started. I was watching the pipe. Pa said the pipe's been wrong for a while. He was going to fix it. He'll fix it now, she said. Silas came back into the kitchen. The ceiling's scorched, but it didn't go through. The lath's intact. He stopped when he saw Tobias at the table helping with her bandage. He stopped completely, for just a moment, and looked at the two of them in the lamplight, and then he came to the table and pulled out a chair across from her. Give me the salve, he said. I've already put it on. Then give me the bandage and I'll do it properly. She let him. He rewrapped her hand with more care than she'd managed herself, pulling the bandage snug enough to be useful without cutting the circulation. And he did it without talking, which was the right way to do it. Tobias watched from the other side of the table. The storm outside was beginning to lose something. Not the wind, that was still full, but the particular edge of it, the freight train pressure of the worst of it, was dropping slightly, the gusts spacing out a little more. Clara came to the kitchen doorway to look at them, and Marin told her to come in and sit down. The worst was past. And Clara came and sat beside Tobias, and Eli came in behind her, still wrapped in his blanket, and sat on Tobias's other side. And the five of them sat in the kitchen with the lamp between them while the storm finished what it was doing to the county. By morning, the storm had passed enough to assess the damage. The kitchen garden had taken a hit. The bean rows were flattened. Some of the squash runners pulled from the ground at the root, Clara's carrot row half buried in debris that had blown across from the shed. The shed itself had lost a section of roof, which was the most serious structural damage and would need patching before rain came, and there was a fence section down in the north paddock. A supply of firewood stacked against the barn's east wall had been mostly scattered. Marin's kitchen window pane had a crack in the lower right corner from something that had struck it during the night, but it hadn't broken through. Silas walked the property with Tobias in the gray early light, and Marin could see them from the kitchen window as she made breakfast one-handed, which was inconvenient but manageable. They walked slowly, Silas looking and Tobias looking, and sometimes one of them crouching to check something and then straightening and moving on. She noticed, watching them, that they were talking. Not the functional back and forth of a man giving instructions to a boy helping him, actually talking, stopping. Tobias saying something and Silas listening and then responding and Tobias listening back. She didn't know what they were saying. She didn't need to. She made porridge and cut bread and put butter on the table and called everyone to breakfast when they came in. Silas sat down and looked at her hand, which was wrapped and resting on the table while she served with the other. How does it feel? It's fine, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. It hurts. It'll hurt for a few days. Then it'll be better. You should have called me. You were in the barn. I was... He stopped. I would have come. I know you would have. She sat down across from him. But I was right there, and I knew what needed doing, and waiting would have made it worse. So I did it. She picked up her spoon. That's all. He was quiet. Clara was putting butter on her bread with excessive concentration, the way children listen while pretending not to. Tobias was looking at Marin with the same look he'd had the first night she arrived, assessing and trying to hide that he was assessing, but it was a different kind of looking now. Less wary, more something else. Eli, who had been eating quietly, looked up from his bowl. "Does it hurt a lot?" he asked. Directly, clearly. More words in a row than he'd volunteered to anyone at the table in the 2 months she'd been there. Everyone at the table was still. Marin looked at him. "Some," she said, "but I've had worse." Eli looked at her hand, then at his bowl. "I'm glad you stopped the fire," he said. "I didn't want to lose the house." His voice was very small and very certain, and his eyes were on his porridge. And nobody said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything to say that would have been worth saying. "Me too," Marin said. The day after the storm was the kind of day that always followed hard nights. Too much to do, not enough of everyone to do it, and a particular quality of exhaustion underneath the work that came from interrupted sleep and the residue of fear. Silas started on the shed roof at first light with lumber from the barn. Tobias worked the fence line in the north paddock. Marin was in the kitchen garden with Clara and Eli, assessing what could be saved and what couldn't. Her left hand made everything harder. She worked around it, doing what she could with the right, and using the left for steadying when she had to, and she didn't mention it because there was no point. And Clara had figured out early on that Marin was right-handing everything and without being asked began doing the tasks that needed two hands, lifting and turning and holding things in place. She didn't say anything about it either. She just did it. That was Clara. By noon they had cleared the debris from the garden rows and replanted what could be replanted and determined that the squash had probably survived where the roots held and might not where they hadn't. They'd know in a few days. Clara's carrot row was recoverable. Eli spent an hour moving small rocks and pieces of debris from between the rows with the focused thoroughness of someone who needed to do something useful and had found it. Ruth Calhoun came out in the early afternoon to check on them, which Marin hadn't expected but was glad for. She came in a wagon with her husband Cal, a quiet man who went straight to where Silas was working on the shed and started handing lumber up without being asked, and Ruth came to the kitchen and looked at Marin's hand and made a short, sharp sound. "You should have a doctor look at that." "There's no doctor in Caldwell Creek. There's one in Hartwell, 12 miles. Then I'd spend a day getting there and a day getting back, and I'd hear the same things I already know," Marin said. "Keep it clean, keep it covered, don't let it get infected." "At least let me look at it properly." Marin let her look. Ruth was businesslike about it, unwrapping and rewrapping with slightly better materials than Marin had, and she left a small tin of something she said she made herself from beeswax and a plant Marin didn't know the name of, and said to use it twice a day. "How did it happen?" Ruth asked. Marin told her. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of Ruth's better qualities. When she finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Silas knows you stopped the fire. He was there when I came in." "And?" Marin looked at her. "And what?" Ruth had a particular expression that Marin was getting to know, where she was thinking something she wasn't certain she should say. "Nothing," she said. "Just asking." "Ruth." Ruth pressed her lips together. Then, "People in this county have been waiting on Silas Boone to give up for about 6 months. Wicks has been saying it so long and so easy that some of them have started believing it even without wanting to." She smoothed the edge of the bandage. "What happened last night? People are going to hear about it. Storm damage gets around, and the way they hear it matters." Marin looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you held that house together last night, literally. And if that gets told right, it means something for this place that Wicks doesn't want people to see." Ruth stood up. "I'm just saying it matters how the story goes." "I'm not interested in stories," Marin said. "I know you're not," Ruth said, "but other people are." She left it there and went to make coffee, and Marin sat at the kitchen table with her hand on the table and looked out the window at Silas and Cal on the shed roof, and thought about what Ruth had said, and thought about Wicks, and thought about what it meant to hold something together, and whether holding it together was ever enough on its own, or whether you also had to be seen holding it. She didn't like that question. She had never liked that question, but she had lived long enough to know it was real. That evening, after the Calhouns had gone and the children were in bed, and the shed roof was patched well enough to hold until it could be done properly, Silas came into the kitchen while she was wrapping her hand again for the night. He sat down across from her without being asked, which he'd started doing, she'd noticed, without quite realizing when it had started. He watched her work the bandage. Then, "That pipe's been wrong since March. I knew it was wrong." "I know," she said. "I kept meaning to fix it." "Things get ahead of you," she said, not soft, just accurate. "It could have been worse." "Yes," she said, "but it wasn't." He was looking at her hand. "You didn't call out. You could have called out for me." "I handled it." "Marin." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for about a month now, which was differently than he'd said it the first few weeks, without the slight formality that had made it sound like a name on a letter rather than a person in a room. "You burned yourself, keeping this house from burning down." She finished the bandage and set her hand on the table. "Yes," she said. "I did. I don't know how to—" He stopped. He was not a man who gave speeches. She knew that about him. "I don't have words for it." "You don't need words for it," she said. He looked at her. Not the careful look at she'd received from him in the first weeks, the assessing and withholding look of a man who'd been disappointed enough to get cautious. This was a different kind of looking, open in a way she hadn't seen from him, and she held it without backing away from it, because she was not someone who backed away from being seen. "You could have left," he said, "after the first week, the second, any of them. The others did." "I know." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. Not performing thought, actually considering, because it was a real question, and he deserved a real answer. "Because the work wasn't done," she said at last. It was simpler than the full truth, which was more complicated and which she wasn't certain she had the language for yet. But it was true, as far as it went. And Silas Boone looked at her across the kitchen table with the lamp between them and whatever had been held back behind his eyes for the 2 months and 4 weeks since she'd knocked on his front door with her battered satchel and her jar of dried herbs. Whatever had been held back began, slowly and not completely, to come forward. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. But the silence was the kind of silence that had more in it than most conversations, and they both knew it. And they sat in it together until the lamp burned lower and she told him to get some sleep, and he went. She stayed in the kitchen a while longer. Her hand throbbed in the way burns throb, rhythmic, insistent, not quite pain and more than discomfort. She looked at it, thought about Ruth saying it matters how the story goes. It mattered. She knew it mattered. But what mattered more, what she was beginning to believe with the kind of certainty that settles into a person quietly rather than arriving all at once, was that the story wasn't over. There was still more to do, still more holding to be done, and not just of houses, and not just against windstorms. She turned down the lamp and went upstairs in the dark, and she could feel through the floor, as she passed Eli's door, the small, even sound of a child sleeping without fear. And that was something. That was enough. That was the thing she had stayed for, even when she'd told herself she stayed because the work wasn't done. She had stayed because this place needed her. She understood that now with a clarity that the storm had burned into her, the same way it had burned her hand, suddenly, and with the kind of immediacy that leaves a mark. The burn healed slower than she would have liked. She'd known it would. Palm burns always did, because the skin there was thick and used and the blistering went deeper than it looked on the surface. But knowing a thing and living through it were different, and the first 4 days after the storm were the kind of days that tested patience in small, grinding ways. She couldn't knead bread. She couldn't wring out the laundry. She couldn't do half the things she normally did in the kitchen without favoring her left hand in a way that made everything take longer and come out slightly wrong, and she was not a woman who liked things coming out slightly wrong. Silas watched her manage without saying anything unhelpful about it, which she appreciated more than she would have said. He took over the water hauling in the mornings without being asked, just appeared at the back door before she was up and did it, and she found the buckets full when she came down, and she didn't thank him more than once, because he didn't seem to want thanks. He seemed to want to be useful in a way that didn't require discussion. She understood that. She'd spent most of her life being useful in a way that didn't require discussion. On the third morning, she came downstairs and found him in the kitchen, not at the tables, at the stove, standing in front of it with the cast iron skillet, and a look of concentrated uncertainty that she recognized as a man attempting a task he'd done before, but not often enough to be comfortable with. There were eggs in the skillet going in the direction of scrambled. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her and looked up. "I was going to have breakfast ready." She looked at the skillet. The eggs were cooked through on the bottom and raw on top, which was what happened when you didn't move them. "How long have those been in?" "Not long." She crossed to the stove, took the spatula from him gently, and pushed the eggs around. They were salvageable. She handed the spatula back. "Keep moving them," she said. "They'll stick if you leave them." He kept moving them. She cut bread with her good hand and set the table. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Not ungrateful, just stating a fact." "I know I don't have to," he said. She looked at him, and he was looking at the eggs, and the back of his neck had a quality about it that said he was choosing his words or choosing not to use words, and she let him choose. He slid the eggs onto a plate and set the skillet to the side and turned around. "You've been doing everything in this house for 3 months," he said, "and then you burn yourself stopping the house from coming down, and you still came down the next morning to start breakfast like it was any other day." He stopped. "I can make eggs." "The eggs are fine," she said. "They're not good," he said, "but they're edible." "That's half of cooking," she said. He almost smiled again. She was getting more of those, the almost smiles, the brief loosening at the corners that said there was something behind the set jaw and the careful distance. She didn't push at them. She just received them when they came. They ate together, just the two of them before the children came down, and it was the first time since she'd arrived that she'd eaten a meal she hadn't made herself, which was a small thing, and not a small thing at all. Clara was the one who noticed her hand most. She noticed it with the particular attentiveness of a child who has been watching an adult closely enough to know what normal looks like and can spot when it changes. The morning after the storm, Clara had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Marin's wrapped hand, and then at Marin's face, and then at the wrapped hand again, and Marin had said, "It's fine," and Clara had said, "I know," in a tone that suggested she was reserving the right to have her own opinion about that. She began doing things. Not the things Marin asked her to do, which she already did. She started doing the things Marin didn't ask for, the extra tasks, the ones that needed doing but that nobody had specifically assigned. She swept the porch without being told. She refilled the water pitcher on the kitchen shelf when it got low. She set the table for meals before Marin mentioned it, and once she cleared the supper dishes entirely on her own and washed and stacked them, and only called Marin in when she couldn't reach the top shelf to put a plate back. She was 8 years old, and she was paying a debt she hadn't incurred, which was what children did when they were frightened and grateful and didn't have the language for either. On the 4th day, when Marin's hand was beginning to look more like healing and less like damage, Clara came to find her in the garden and sat down beside her on the low fence rail without preamble. "My mama used to tell us stories at night," Clara said. She was looking out at the flat country beyond the paddock, not at Marin. Before she got sick, she'd sit on the edge of the bed and tell us one story, and then she'd say, "That's the end, go to sleep," and Eli would always ask for one more, and sometimes she'd do one more and sometimes she wouldn't. Marin waited. "I can't remember all of the stories anymore," Clara said. "I remember some of them, but some of them I can only remember little pieces of, like the middle part or the end, and I can't remember how they started." She paused. "It bothers me." "I know," Marin said. "Does it get better?" Marin thought about it honestly. "The feeling that it bothers you gets less sharp," she said. "The pieces you have stay. You stop losing more of them after a while." Clara considered this. She was a serious child, the kind who weighed things. "Tobias says he remembers her voice, but not her face very well. He gets upset about that." "Does he talk to you about it?" "Sometimes, more lately." Clara looked at her. "He didn't used to. He used to just go outside when he was feeling bad. Pa does that too." She paused. "You don't do that." "Do what?" "Go outside when you're feeling bad." "No," Marin said. "I tend to cook something." Clara seemed to find this logical. "The bread you made last week was really good," she said. "Thank you." "It was the kind with the seeds on top." "Caraway? Your mother's seeds from the back of the spice shelf. I wasn't sure they were still good, but they were." Clara was very still for a moment. She grew those in Missouri before we came out here. She brought the seeds with her. Marin had not known that. She held it carefully. Then it was a good loaf of bread, she said. Clara nodded. She sat on the fence rail for a little while longer, not saying anything else. And then she went back inside, and Marin stayed in the garden with her hands in the dirt and thought about a woman she'd never met who had carried caraway seeds across the country because she wanted to grow them, and what it meant to carry things forward, and what it meant to leave things behind. It was Tobias who brought the Wicks thing back to the surface. He'd been in Caldwell Creek with Silas for the stock sale assessment, the one Whittier had mentioned, the 23rd, and he'd heard something. She knew he'd heard something because he came back with the particular tight-faced look she'd learned to read on him, the look where he was carrying information and hadn't decided what to do with it yet. He came to the kitchen after supper when Clara and Eli were upstairs and Silas was on the porch. He sat down at the table and Marin poured him a cup of coffee, which she'd started doing somewhere in the past month because he was 12, and it was mostly chicory and warm milk with a little coffee in it. And he drank it, and she sat across from him and waited. Wicks was at the stock sale, he said. What did he do? Nothing, really. He was talking to people, to Hensley, and to the Marsh brothers, and to Alderman Price. He turned the cup in his hands. I heard him say, he didn't know I could hear him. He said the Boone place was barely holding on. He said it was a matter of time. He said the housekeeper situation was... He stopped. Was what? Tobias looked at her. His jaw had the same set to it his father's had. He said it was a sign. That the place needed a keeper as much as a housekeeper, and that Silas was in over his head. Marin was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup once on the table. Did your father hear it? I don't think so. He was talking to Whittier. Good. Tobias looked at her. Why is it good? Because then it didn't put him in a position where he had to respond to it on someone else's ground. She looked at him. Wicks wants to get a reaction at the stock sale, in front of people would give him something to use. Your father staying out of earshot means Wicks got nothing. Tobias thought about that. Did you know he was going to do something like that? I knew he was going to do something, she said. He's been positioning for months. The East Pasture lease, the housekeeping talk. He wants people to see this place as failing so that when your father eventually sells, Wicks looks like he's doing Silas a favor rather than taking advantage. Pa won't sell. I know he won't. Then what does Wicks get out of it? He's patient, she said. He's betting that the pressure of being seen a certain way will wear your father down. Some men it does. She looked at Tobias directly. Your father isn't one of them, but it's not comfortable to be talked about that way, and Wicks knows it. Tobias was quiet. What do we do? The we was not lost on her. She didn't show that it wasn't lost on her, because making much of it would embarrass him and diminish the thing. But she heard it. We keep doing what we're doing, she said. The ranch running well is the argument against what Wicks is saying. There's no better one. That's it? That's it, she said. It's not exciting, but it works. He finished his coffee. Then, what if it doesn't work fast enough? It was a good question. She respected him enough to give it a real answer. Then your father will have to make harder decisions. But we're not there yet. He looked at her, and for a moment he looked very young, which he was, and then he looked the way he mostly looked, which was like someone who had decided to be older than he was because the situation required it. He trusts you, Tobias said, more than he's trusted anybody in a long time, I think. She didn't know what to say to that. She said the thing that was true and manageable. I'm not going to waste it. He nodded once and went upstairs, and she sat in the kitchen for a while with the lamp turned low and thought about Wicks and about ground and about what it meant to hold something. The conversation she hadn't expected happened on a Sunday, which was the one day the pace of the ranch allowed something close to rest, though rest was relative and mostly meant the pace dropped from urgent to steady. Silas had come in from the barn at mid-morning and hadn't gone back out, which was unusual. He sat at the front room table with the ranch ledger for a while, and then he wasn't looking at the ledger anymore. He was just sitting, and after a while he put it away and sat without it. Marin was mending in the chair by the window. The children were outside. The house was quiet in the specific way frontier houses were quiet on Sunday mornings, a deep quiet that had the space of the land in it. Her name was Ellen, Silas said. Marin looked up. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance the way people look when they're pulling something forward that has been sitting far back for a long time. She set the mending in her lap and waited. She was from Illinois. She'd never been west of Indiana before I took her out here. He paused. She never complained about it. Not once. She said she'd chosen it, and complaining about your choices was a waste of time. Something moved across his face. She was right about that. She sounds like she was practical, Marin said. She was. More than I was, a lot of the time. He shifted his hands on the table. She got sick in October. We thought it was a cold. It wasn't a cold. By December, he stopped. It went fast. That's what the doctor in Hartwell said afterward, that sometimes they went fast as if that was supposed to help. It doesn't help, Marin said. No. He was quiet. I wasn't ready. I know everyone says that. Nobody's ready. But I wasn't ready in a practical sense either. I didn't know how the household ran. I didn't know what she did, or how she did it, or what the children needed day to day because she'd managed all of it, and I'd managed the ranch. And that had been a system that worked, and then it didn't. He paused. And I missed her. I missed her so much I couldn't think straight for a long time. And a ranch doesn't stop because you can't think straight. And children don't stop needing things because you can't think straight. And he pressed his hands flat on the table. I failed them for a while. I know I did. Tobias taking on what he took on, Eli going quiet, Clara with her tin under the bed. I know. I wasn't there the way I should have been. Marin held the mending in her hands and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish what he'd just put on the table. I wasn't easy on the women who came to help, he said. I know that too. I don't know what I expected. I expected something I couldn't have named, and when they weren't it, I wasn't. I made it harder than it needed to be. You made it harder on yourself too, she said. He looked at her. Expecting something you can't name is a hard way to live, she said. You can't find it because you don't know what it is. You just know it's missing. He was still looking at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. They sat with that for a while. Outside, she could hear the children's voices somewhere, and the sound of the horse in the paddock, and the wind coming across the flat land in the particular way it came on Sunday mornings when it was steady and not threatening. She would have liked you, he said. Ellen would have liked you. Marin looked at him. It was a harder thing to receive than she would have expected. That's a kind thing to say. I mean it. She believed him. Tell me something else about her, she said. Not the sick part. Before. He looked at her for a moment, surprised in a quiet way. Then he thought for a while, and when he started talking, the quality of his voice was different. Not easier, but different. The way a door is different when it opens inward rather than out. A different kind of movement. He told her about Ellen's terrible sense of direction and the time she'd gotten turned around on their own property and come in 2 hours after she'd meant to, completely unruffled, saying she'd found an interesting rock formation. He told her about the way she sang while she cooked, not well, with great confidence. He told her about the winter before Eli was born, when she'd learned to play a harmonica because Tobias had wanted one, and she'd decided she'd better learn it before teaching him. And she'd never gotten good at it, and Tobias had never gotten good at it either, but they'd made a terrible racket together every Sunday evening for about 3 months, and the horses had stood at the far end of the paddock during those sessions, and that had been a family joke for years. He talked for a long time. Marin listened. The room held it. When he stopped, it was gradual, not abrupt. He ran down the way a creek runs down at the end of summer, still moving but quieter. He sat for a moment in the aftermath of having talked more than he'd talked in months and looked out the window. Thank you, he said. She didn't ask what for. She thought she knew. She's still in this house, she said, and in the children, in the caraway seeds on the spice shelf. She paused. In Eli asking why about things again. Silas looked at her sharply. He's been asking why again? The last week, small things. He asked me why the bread rises, why the crows sit on the west fence post and not the others, Why the stars look closer out here than back east. She looked at him. He's coming back. Silas looked at the table. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and then he put them down and cleared his throat. Good, he said roughly. That's good. Yes, she said. It is. The push from Wicks came 2 weeks after the stock sale, not from Wicks himself, but through a man named Alderman Price, who was on the County Land Assessment Board and who showed up at Blackstone Ranch on a Tuesday with a clipboard and an official manner and said there had been a complaint about the structural integrity of the outbuildings following the storm, and he was there to conduct an assessment. Silas was in the barn when Price rode up. Marin answered the door. Price was a thin man in his 40s with a mustache that was more effort than it was worth, and the particular manner of a man who knows he's doing someone else's work and isn't entirely comfortable with it. He showed her his appointment from the county board. She looked at it carefully. Mr. Boone is on the property, she said. I'll get him. I can proceed without... You can wait, she said pleasantly. I'll be right back. She went to the barn. Silas was working on the harness rigging, and she told him quickly and low what was at the door and who had sent it, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was mastering something, and then she watched him master it. All right, he said. He set the harness down and picked up his hat. What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic. That was the thing about real confrontations. The important ones rarely were. Price walked the property with Silas, and Marin followed at a slight distance, which she'd done deliberately because she wanted to see and because her presence was a form of evidence and she knew it. She'd been in this household 3 months, and she was visible, and she was staying. That was information. Price assessed the shed roof, which was patched solidly and would hold the winter. He assessed the barn, which was in good repair. He assessed the fence line, which Tobias had fixed properly, and the outbuilding, and the house itself. He wrote things on his clipboard. He was professional and not unkind, and he was clearly not finding what he'd been sent to find. At the end, he stood by his horse and looked at his clipboard and then at Silas. Everything's in acceptable order, he said. The shed roof is a patch rather than a replace, but it meets the standard. I'll get it replaced before winter, Silas said. That'd be prudent. Price looked at him, and then, because he was a man who wasn't entirely comfortable with what he was doing, I want you to know I'm just doing my job, Boone. Silas looked at him steadily. I know whose job it is, Alderman. Price nodded, mounted, and rode out. They watched him go. After a moment, Tobias, who had materialized at the barn door and clearly heard the end of it, said, Wicks? Wicks, Silas said. What do we do? Silas looked at the ranch. All of it. The repaired shed, and the clean paddock, and the garden rows, and the house with its new stovepipe joint that Marin had supervised the installation of the week before. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has built and might lose, and has decided not to lose. We keep going, he said. Tobias looked at Marin. She nodded. He nodded back. That evening, Ruth Calhoun sent word through her husband that Price had filed his assessment with the county board that afternoon, outcome satisfactory. The complaint was closed. It would not be refiled on the same grounds. She told Silas. He sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. Ruth's been a good friend, he said. She has, Marin agreed. I haven't been. I've kept to myself more than was good. After Ellen, I let things go on the neighbor side. He paused. People like Ruth, the Calhouns. I should have leaned on them more. You can lean on them now, Marin said. People remember how long it took you to ask, he said. Some do, she said. The ones worth keeping don't. He looked at her. Then he said something he hadn't said before, hadn't quite managed before, in the months she'd been there. I don't know what this place would look like right now without you. She received that carefully. It mattered more than she'd expected it to, and she knew it was going to matter more later when she was alone and had time to think about it. It would look like a ranch that was still trying, she said. Not as hard, he said. She thought about what to say, and said the thing that was true and not more than true. You would have found a way. I'm not sure of that. I am, she said. And she was. She'd seen what was in him. It had taken time to see it, and he'd made it harder than it needed to be, but it was there. The thing that said he would not quit. That was not her doing. That was his. He looked at her for a long time, the lamp between them, the house quiet around them. Why does it matter to you, he said. This place. These children. You came here for a job. She thought about Clara's caraway seeds and Eli asking why, and Tobias holding a bandage strip without shaking in the middle of the night, and about Silas sitting in the front room talking about a woman who got turned around on her own property and came back unruffled, talking about her like she was still somewhere nearby that could be pointed to. I came here for a job, she said. And then I came here. He held her eyes, and she held his, and she let the weight of what that meant sit in the room between them without taking it back or softening it. He didn't move closer. She didn't either. This was not that kind of moment. Not yet, and they both knew it. But the walls that he'd built in the 8 months since Ellen died, the careful, maintained, reasonable walls that had kept him functional and separate and managing, she could feel them sitting differently in the room. Not fallen, not gone, but no longer holding the same way. That was enough. That was more than enough. She got up and cleared the cups and told him to get some sleep. He stayed at the table a moment after she turned to the sink, and then she heard him push the chair back and go, and she stood at the sink with the warm water over her healing hands, and thought about what it meant to come somewhere for a job and stay for a reason you couldn't have named when you arrived. The land outside was dark and flat and enormous. The stars out here were everything Eli said they were. Closer than anywhere she'd lived before. Close enough to feel like they had something to do with you personally. She dried her hands and turned down the lamp and went upstairs. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackstone Ranch, she stood in her small east-facing room and didn't think about what came next. She just stood there, in the place she was, and let it be where she was. That was new. That was everything. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. Maren had been at the ranch 4 months and 3 weeks by then, close enough to 5 months that she'd stopped counting in months and started thinking of time in seasons. She had arrived at the end of spring, and summer had come and gone in the way Wyoming summer went, fast and bright and a little brutal. And now the mornings had the particular cool edge that said August was thinking about becoming September whether anyone was ready or not. The kitchen garden was at its fullest and most demanding. Clara's carrots had come in well enough that the girl had spent an entire Sunday afternoon pulling them and washing them and laying them out on the kitchen table to be counted. And Eli had counted them with her twice, once to get the number, and once because he wanted to make sure the first count was right, and the number was 43, which Clara had announced to the supper table with the satisfaction of a person who has built something from nothing and knows it. The hand had healed. There were 2 small scars on the inside of her first 2 fingers, coin-thin and pale, that she thought would probably stay. She didn't mind. She'd been marked by her work before. Most things that mattered left a mark of some kind. The letter was in the mail packet that Silas brought back from Caldwell Creek, and he set it on the kitchen table for her while she was out in the garden, and when she came in and saw the handwriting on the envelope, she stood looking at it for a moment before she picked it up. The return address was Denver, Colorado. A woman named Mrs. Harriet Folsom, who was the wife of a substantial mining interest and who had written to Maren through a mutual domestic employment contact in Cheyenne. Maren had applied to the Folsom household 7 months ago, before the advertisement for Blackstone Ranch, and had heard nothing back and eventually stopped expecting to. She sat down at the kitchen table and opened the letter. Mrs. Folsom was apologetic about the delay, a matter explained in 2 careful paragraphs, and was now writing to offer Maren the position of head housekeeper in the Folsom residence in Denver, a 4-story house with a full domestic staff, good wages that were considerably higher than what Silas was paying, a private room with its own window and access to the household library, and the kind of stability that a large established household offered, the kind you didn't have to fight for season by season. Maren read the letter twice. Then she folded it and set it on the table and sat looking at the wall. She was still sitting there when Clara came in from outside, tracking garden dirt across the floor she'd swept that morning, and stopped when she saw Maren's face. Children were good at faces. Clara had always been particularly good at faces. "What's that?" Clara said, looking at the folded letter. "A job offer," Maren said. Clara was very still. "A different job?" "Yes." "Where?" "Denver." The word landed in the kitchen the way words land when they're the name of somewhere far away and the person hearing it knows that far away means gone. Clara looked at the letter, and then at Maren, and then at the letter again, and she didn't say anything, which was unlike her. "I haven't decided anything," Maren said. But you're thinking about it, Clara said. I'm thinking about it, Marin agreed, because Clara deserved honesty more than she deserved comfort, and Marin had always known the difference between those two things. Clara picked up a carrot from the pile she'd been planning to bring in and held it in both hands and looked at it. Our first housekeeper smelled like lavender, and she left after 2 weeks, she said, as if cataloging. The second one gave Eli her handkerchief when he cried, and then she left. The third one read to us once and then left. The fourth one never even learned our names. She set the carrot down. You learned our names before supper on the first day. Marin said nothing. I know you're not our mother, Clara said. She said it carefully, with the precision of a child who has worked out exactly what she means before she says it. I know that. I'm not asking for that. A pause. I'm just saying you learned our names. She took her carrots and went back outside, and Marin sat at the kitchen table with the folded letter and the empty room and the kitchen that smelled like the herbs she'd hung from the ceiling beam and the particular smell of a household that was being properly cared for, and she thought about Denver. But she didn't tell Silas that day. She wasn't ready to tell him, which itself told her something, because she was not normally a person who needed to be ready to share practical information. The fact that this felt like more than practical information was itself information she was still sorting through. She told him the following evening. He was at the table where he'd taken to sitting after supper in the past few weeks, not working, just present, in the way she'd come to understand was his version of being part of the household, rather than adjacent to it. She set the letter on the table in front of him and sat down. He read it. He read it the way he read everything, steadily and without visible reaction, but she was close enough and knew him well enough now to see the thing that moved through him when he got to the part about the wages. He set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment, not at her. That's a good offer, he said. Yes, she said. Better wages than I'm paying you. Considerably. He nodded once, slow. His hands were flat on the table, the way they got when he was holding something steady. The Folsom household, that's established money. Denver's not going anywhere. He paused. It's the kind of position that doesn't come open often. No, she said. It doesn't. Have you decided? Not yet. He looked up at her then. She held his eyes. Marin, he said, and then he stopped, and she could see him doing the thing he did when he was measuring his words, not to protect himself the way he'd done at the beginning, but to make sure what he said was accurate, was fair, was the truth, and not something lesser wearing the truth's clothing. I'm not going to ask you to stay, he said. I'm not going to tell you what you should do. You've given this place more than you were hired to give it, and if that opportunity is the better life for you, I've got no business standing in the way of it. She looked at him. Is that all you wanted to say? He was quiet for a moment, then, no. He took a breath and let it out slowly. No, it's not all I wanted to say, but the rest of it, he looked at the table. The rest of it is about what I want, and I'm not sure that's what this conversation should be about. Silas. She waited until he looked at her. What do you want? He met her eyes. I want you to stay, he said. Plain, undecorated. The words of a man who had decided that whatever the cost of honesty was, the cost of its absence was higher. Not because this ranch needs you, because... He stopped, tried again. Because I wake up in the mornings, and the first thing I think about is that you're downstairs. Because the children they're living again, Clara and Eli and Tobias. They're living in a way they weren't before you got here. And I know some of that is time, I know that. But I know what it looks like when time is the only thing doing the work, and that's not what this is. He pressed his hands harder on the table, and he stopped again. Because when I thought about you reading that letter, I thought about this house without you in it, and it looked like October again, like the worst part of last October. And He cut himself off. He was not a man made for speeches, and he knew it, and the effort of this one was visible on his face. I don't want it to look like that again. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the late August evening was cooling toward that particular blue that came before dark, and the first of the year's crickets had started somewhere in the grass beyond the paddock. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. That was something she'd noticed about him, that under all the reserve and the closed doors and the careful management of his own expressions, he could be looked at. He didn't flinch from it. He just sat there and let her see him. I'll need to think about it, she said. A few days? All right, he said. No argument, no pressure. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, and she got up and washed the cups and went to bed. And she lay in her east-facing room with the window open and the cool air coming in off the land, and she thought about Denver. She thought about it honestly, which meant she thought about what she actually wanted rather than what made sense on paper. What made sense on paper was Denver. Better wages, more stability, an established household, a city with a library and variety, and the kind of anonymity that let you build a life on your own terms without the whole county knowing your business. She had lived that kind of life before. She knew how to do it. She was good at it. What she lay awake thinking about was not Denver. She thought about Eli's voice asking about the stars. She thought about Clara's row of 43 carats laid out on the kitchen table to be counted. She thought about Tobias holding the bandage strip steady at 4:30 in the morning without being asked. She thought about Silas in the front room on a Sunday, talking about a woman who had carried caraway seeds across the country because she wanted to grow them, talking about her with a grief that had finally, slowly, been allowed out into the air. She thought about the morning she'd arrived, the crow on the fence post, the empty wood box, the curtain missing from the front window, the way Silas had looked at her like she was the wrong answer, the way the children had sat in a row at the kitchen table like birds on a wire, watching her cook. She thought about what it had taken to get from that morning to this one. Not transformation. She had never believed in transformations. What she believed in was accumulation. Small days stacked against each other, each one a little more solid than the last, until you looked back and saw that the stack had become something structural, something that held weight. That was what she'd built here. Not because she'd planned to build it, because she'd stayed long enough for it to happen. The question wasn't whether Denver was a better opportunity. It probably was, in the ways opportunities were measured. The question was what she was going to do with the fact that she'd stopped measuring in those ways somewhere between the first month and the fifth, somewhere between the day she hummed a song and Eli came the rest of the way into the kitchen, and the night she held a burning stovepipe joint with her hands because the children were upstairs and she was the one who was there. She knew what she was going to do. She'd known it when she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the letter the first time. The thinking was just the part where she let herself arrive at what she already knew, properly, and without shortcuts. There was one more thing that needed to happen first. Gerald Wicks came to Blackstone Ranch on a Saturday morning, and this time he didn't come when Silas was out on the property. He came knowing Silas would be there, which meant it was a different kind of visit than the first one. Not reconnaissance, but direct approach. He rode up with a man she didn't know, younger, carrying what looked like a document case, and Silas met them in the yard. Marin watched from the kitchen window. Then she dried her hands and went out. She came out of the back door and around the side of the house without hurrying, without making an entrance, just came around the corner and stood at a reasonable distance and said nothing. Wicks saw her and acknowledged her with a nod, and then returned his attention to Silas. Wicks was making an offer. She could tell from the shape of the conversation even before she caught the words. The tone of a man who has arrived prepared, who has a number ready, who believes the number is going to do what he needs it to do. The younger man opened the document case. "I've had the parcel assessed," Wicks was saying. "Independent assessor, not county. The number I'm bringing you is fair, and it accounts for current market and the condition of the improvements." He paused. "It's a real offer, Silas, not a lowball." Silas looked at the document the younger man held out. He didn't take it. "I'm not selling," he said. "I know that's been your position." "It's still my position." Wicks looked at him with the patience of a man who has been patient for a long time and doesn't mind waiting longer. "The East Pasture lease runs out in November. The margins on this operation have been—" "Gerald," Silas's voice was even. "I'm not selling. I'm not trying to push you into anything. I'm showing you a number. Look at the number. Sleep on it. And if you want to talk it—" He said no. It was Tobias's voice. He came from the direction of the barn, still carrying the brush he'd been using on the gray gelding, and he stopped at the edge of the conversation with the set jaw and his father's particular quality of stillness. He was 12 years old, and he stood like he'd been standing in that yard his whole life because he had. Wicks looked at the boy. Then he looked at Silas. Then his eyes moved to Marin, and she held his look without moving, without speaking. just standing there solid and present in a way that said she was part of this place and had been for a while and was going to go on being. The younger man lowered the document case slightly. Wicks looked around the yard. The barn was in good repair. The fence line was solid. The garden at the side of the house was productive and tended. The house itself had the curtain back in the front window, which it hadn't had when she'd arrived. These were small things. They added up to something that could be seen. "I'm doing you a courtesy, Boone," Wicks said, but his voice had lost some of its prepared quality. He was reading the yard the way a man reads a room when it's telling him something he hadn't expected. "I appreciate the courtesy," Silas said. "My answer is the same." Wicks stood for a moment longer. Then he took the document case from the younger man himself and closed the clasp and handed it back. He put his hat on, which he'd been holding. "You know where to find me," he said, "if your thinking changes." "I know where to find you," Silas agreed. Wicks mounted and rode out. The younger man followed. They watched them go, all three of them, Silas, Tobias, Marin, standing in the yard in a line without having arranged it, and then the horses were past the gate and the road dust was settling. Tobias looked at the brush in his hand. "He'll be back," he said. "Probably," Silas said. "What do we do?" "Same thing we did today," Silas said. "We stand here." Tobias looked at his father for a moment. Then he looked at Marin. "You staying?" he said. Not to either of them specifically, to both of them. Marin looked at the boy, at his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, at the brush in his hand and the new boots on his feet, and the 12-year-old weight he'd put down somewhere in the past 5 months, because somebody had helped him put it down. "Yes," she said. Tobias nodded. He went back to the barn. Silas turned and looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was clear and the light was good, and there was nothing between them but air and the distance she could cross in 2 steps if she chose to. "Yes?" he said. "Yes?" she said. He let out a breath. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something bigger than relief, something that relief was only part of. "I should tell you," he said, "that I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is, I haven't, since Ellen. I know," she said. "I don't know how either, not this kind." "Then we're starting from the same place." "More or less," she said. He looked at her. "I want to do right by you," he said. "Not just by the ranch. By you, Marin. I want that to be clear." "It's clear," she said. And it was. She believed him. She wrote to Mrs. Folsom that afternoon. She wrote it carefully, with respect for the offer, and without minimizing it, thanking her for the position and declining. She sealed the letter and gave it to Silas for the next mail run, and she didn't second-guess it, because second-guessing was the kind of thing you did when you hadn't decided yet, and she had decided. What happened next was not a transformation. She would keep insisting on this, even later, even when people wanted to frame it as one. What happened was this work continued. September came in cool and deliberate, and the kitchen garden came in behind it, preserved and stored and accounted for, every jar lined up on the cellar shelf with Marin's handwriting on the labels in her practical hand. Clara had 3 jars marked specifically with her name, for the vegetables from her row, and she checked on them with a proprietary air that made Tobias roll his eyes with a 14-year-old's aggravation, which meant he was invested enough to pretend he wasn't. The shed roof got replaced properly before the weather changed, Silas and Cal Calhoun working 3 days on it together, and Ruth brought food for the work days and stayed both afternoons, and there was a quality to those afternoons that Marin thought about later. The ease of people who've decided to be neighbors rather than acquaintances. The specific warmth of a house that has decided to open rather than close. Silas talked more than she'd heard him talk with people he wasn't obligated to talk to. Ruth noticed and said so in her practical way. "He's better," as if reporting a temperature. "He is," Marin said. "You both are," Ruth said, which was Ruth's way of saying something direct that she'd leave Marin to unpack on her own time. The Wicks situation resolved not through confrontation, but through the slow erosion of his narrative. Whittier had apparently told several people about the county assessment outcome, and what circulated in Caldwell Creek through September was a corrected version of events. A ranch that had come through a hard summer intact, a housekeeper who'd kept her head in a fire and her hands on a burning pipe, a family that was running what it had and not looking to be bought out. Small towns corrected their own narratives eventually, if the evidence was there. The evidence was there. Wicks did not come back. Not that season. She thought he would come back eventually, in some form, because men like Wicks were patient and persistent, and that didn't change. But the ground had shifted under the particular story he'd been telling, and resetting that ground would take him time, and in that time, Blackstone Ranch would continue becoming what it was becoming, which was harder to buy out every month that passed. Tobias turned 13 in October, and they had a supper for it that was not elaborate but was deliberate. A meal made with care. The specific things he'd mentioned liking without ever asking for them directly, because Marin had been listening for those mentions for weeks. He came to the table and looked at what was on it, and then looked at her with an expression that was the closest to unguarded she'd seen from him, and he said, "You remembered." And she said, "I was listening." And he sat down and didn't say anything else about it, which was the right response. Silas gave him the gray gelding. Formally, with a piece of paper that said it was Tobias's horse, which Silas had written up with Marin watching, and which he handed to Tobias after the birthday supper, with the awkward formality of a man who doesn't know how to give gifts, but knew this one mattered. Tobias took the paper and looked at it and pressed his lips together and said, "Thank you, Pa," in a voice that was working hard to stay level, and Silas put his hand on the back of his son's neck, the same way he had the night of the storm, and that was the whole thing, complete. Eli started talking. It didn't happen all at once. It accumulated, the way everything in this household accumulated, one small addition at a time. The questions had started coming back in September, the why questions, and by October he was asking them constantly, all day, about everything he saw. Why did the leaves change? Why did the horses have different temperaments? Why did the cornbread come out drier some days than others? Why did some stars look yellow and some look white? Marin answered what she knew and said she didn't know what she didn't know, and suggested who might know. And Eli added each answer to some internal architecture he was building, stacking them up with the seriousness of a person who believes understanding things is important work, which it was. He started talking about his mother, not all the time, not in the raw, disorganized way of fresh grief, but in the way children talk about people who have become part of the permanent landscape of who they are. He'd say, at random moments, "My mama used to," or "My mama said," and then he'd say the thing, and then he'd move on to whatever was next. And the saying of it was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all. One evening, he came to find Marin in the kitchen before bed, and stood at the doorway in his nightclothes, which he still did sometimes, the old habit. "Marin," he said. "What is it? Are you going to stay here?" She turned and looked at him. He was 5 years old, and his feet were bare, and his hair needed cutting, and his eyes were as clear as anything she'd ever looked at in her life. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to stay here." He considered this with the thoroughness he brought to everything. "Good," he said, "because I think this is your house now, too." She looked at him for a moment. "Go to bed, Eli." "Okay," he said, perfectly amiable, and went. She stood in the kitchen after he left, alone, with the lamp burning and the house around her, and she thought about what it took to become part of somewhere. Not what it looked like from the outside, which was always cleaner and simpler than the reality. Not the before and after of a story told in summary, where a woman arrived and things improved and hearts opened and life went on. That was the outline. The outline was true as far as it went. What it actually took was showing up on a day when nobody was particularly glad you were there, and then showing up the next day and the day after that. It was making the bread when the bread was what was needed, and holding the pipe joint when the pipe joint was what was needed, and listening when listening was what was needed, and speaking plainly when plain speaking was what was needed. It was being wrong sometimes and knowing it, and being tired sometimes and not stopping, and being afraid sometimes, not often. She was not a person prone to fear, but sometimes, and going out the door anyway because the alternative was going back inside, and she was not built for going back inside. It was not heroic. That was the thing that nobody told you, and the thing that mattered most. The stories people told about courage made it sound like an event, a moment, a single decision that changed everything. And there were moments. She had her moment, her hands on the burning pipe in the dark, but the moment was not the whole of it, not even most of it. The whole of it was the ordinary days that made the moment possible. The daily decision to stay and do the work and be present and give a real answer when a real answer was needed, and an honest one when honesty was what was required. She had stayed because she was suited, which was what she'd told Silas on the first night. She had stayed because the work wasn't done, which was what she'd told him later. Both of those were true, but the truest thing, the thing that didn't have a clean sentence around it yet, was that she had stayed because this was where she had been needed in a way that fit her exactly, and finding that fit, at 35, after 16 years of being useful in other people's places without ever quite belonging to any of them, finding that fit was not something you walked away from. You stayed. You did the work. You let the place become yours and you became part of it. And that was not a small thing. That was the whole thing. The conversation happened on a Sunday in November, which was appropriate because Sunday was the day the ranch breathed a little easier. And Silas had been building toward it for weeks, in the way he built toward things, slowly and with considerable internal preparation. He asked her to walk with him to the north fence line, which she did, because the north fence line was where you could see the whole of the property from, the house and the barn and the outbuildings and the garden and the paddock and the flat land running east toward town, all of it visible from that one point. They stood at the fence rail in the November light, which was low and clear, and had a quality that made everything look considered, and Silas looked at the property for a long time without speaking, and she stood beside him and let him look. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." He turned to face her. He had his hat in his hand, which meant he'd taken it off at some point without her noticing, which was its own kind of statement. "I want to ask you to stay, not as the housekeeper." He stopped. Not just as the housekeeper. He was working through it, not smoothly, which was fine. She didn't want smooth. "I want you to be part of this place in a real way. I want to build this ranch beside you, not just have you keep it running while I'm out in the field." He held her eyes. "I know I don't have much to offer that's easy. The margins are thin, and Wicks is still out there, and the winter's coming, and 3 children is 3 children." He paused. "But I'm asking." She looked at him, at his face in the November light, at the hat in his hands and the property behind him and the house with smoke coming out of the new stovepipe joint that was properly fitted now and would not crack in a windstorm. "I know you don't have much to offer that's easy," she said. "I've been here 5 months. I know exactly what you've got." "And?" he said. "And I already said yes," she said. "Last month, in the yard, when Tobias asked." He looked at her. "That was about staying." "It was about all of it," she said. "I knew what it was about." He held her look for a long moment. Then he shook his head slightly, and it was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough to be the real thing. "You could have said so. You weren't ready to hear it yet." He thought about that. "You might be right." "I usually am," she said. "You've had 5 months to notice." He looked at her for another moment. Then he put his hat back on and offered her his arm, the way men offered their arm in those years. And she took it the way women took arms when they meant to. And they walked back toward the house along the fence line in the November light with the whole of Blackstone Ranch around them. She was not going to pretend she knew how everything would go from here. That was not how life operated, and she had never been the kind of person who pretended otherwise. There would be hard seasons and thin margins, and Wicks would try again eventually, and the children would grow into their own troubles as children did. And she and Silas would disagree about things because 2 people who were both direct and stubborn disagreed about things, and it would not be easy in the particular way that nothing real was easy. But walking back toward the house with the smell of November in the air and the sound of the children somewhere inside, she could hear them, Clara's voice going up at the end of a sentence, Tobias's lower tone responding, and underneath them the particular quality of Eli's voice asking something. She felt, with a clarity that had nothing sentimental in it, that she was walking toward something she had built. Not alone, but she had been part of the building of it, stone by stone, day by day, meal by meal, and early morning and late night. And the structure was solid, and it was real, and it would hold through what came next. That was what she had. That was everything. There's something people get wrong about strength, and she had spent most of her adult life watching them get it wrong. They thought it was the dramatic thing, the visible thing, the moment that everyone could see and point to and say there, that's where it happened. That's where she proved herself. And yes, there was the moment. There was always the moment, the stovepipe, the smoke, the burning hands. She didn't discount the moment. But the truth was, the moment was only possible because of every ordinary day that came before it. Every early morning and every meal and every time she hadn't left when leaving would have been understandable. Every time she'd answered a question honestly instead of easily, every time she'd stayed in the room instead of going out of it. The moment was just the day the accumulation showed, and what she'd learned. What 5 months on a flatland Wyoming ranch with 3 grieving children and a closed-off man and a thin ledger and a windstorm and Gerald Wicks and 43 carats had taught her was that the accumulation was the point. The showing up was the thing, not once, not in a crisis, but every day, in the small ordinary moments that didn't look like anything while they were happening and were, in fact, everything. The door of the house opened before they reached it, and Clara was in the doorway looking at them with the assessing eyes she'd had since the first week. And she looked at Marin's hand on Silas's arm and at their faces, and she said, with the directness of a child who has decided something, "Are you going to stay forever?" Marin looked at her. "That's a long time, Clara." "I know it's a long time," Clara said. "Are you?" Silas looked at Marin. She looked at Clara. Inside, she could hear Eli asking something of Tobias, and Tobias's voice answering with a patience he'd been building all year, one day at a time. "Yes," Marin said. "I think I am." Clara stepped back to let them in. The door closed behind them, and the house held everything inside it. The warmth, the voices, the smell of bread she'd put to rise that morning before the walk, the 43 jars on the cellar shelf, the gray gelding in the paddock belonging to a boy who was learning what it meant to care for something, the caraway seeds that had come from Missouri in the pocket of a woman who believed in carrying things forward. The fire burned in the grate. The stovepipe held. Blackstone Ranch sat on its land in the November light, ordinary and improbable and entirely itself. Not the best-run operation in the county, not the wealthiest, not the most impressive thing you'd see if you drove the road between Caldwell Creek and Hartwell. Just a place where people had decided to stay. Where a woman who was 35 years old and had been useful in other people's houses for 16 years had finally, quietly, without ceremony or announcement, come home. And home was not a place that was handed to you. She knew that now in her bones, in the scars on her palm, in the way she said yes to a 5-year-old asking forever like it was a reasonable question. Home was the place you stayed long enough to build, day by ordinary day, until the building was the thing itself, and you were part of it, and it was part of you, and there was nothing left to prove and nowhere else to go. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. That was everything.